Okay, let's switch to the chapter on validity. Validity was, without question, the most important concept in educational measurement, whether it's standardized test or teacher-made test. Validity has to do with whether or not a test measure or an item measures what's designed to measure. Does this test measure what was taught and learned? How do we go about determining validity on our test? Well, there are three basic ways that one can pull out of that chapter and that are typically done in validity studies. One is content validity. Does the test measure what was taught? And in our case, in Florida specifically, does it measure the standards that you were supposed to be teaching all year long? There's also a method called construct validity. Does the test measure the characteristic or the quality or the construct that is designed to measure? For example, a construct of understanding the scientific method, does this test measure that? Or the construct of empathy or compassion or self-efficacy, does this particular instrument measure those particular constructs? Another method is called the criterion or predictive validity model method of determining validity. Does this test positively correlate with other measures of the very same thing? Content validity. Now, here we go. This really can apply to a classroom teacher and your classroom-based test. And it also applies for standardized tests as well. I like to think of matrix of instruction and assessment. For example, in the column, if you take a look at your slide, there's a matrix there. If you look at the left-hand column, your objectives, objective 1, 2, 3, 4. You can actually map out, this is called a table of specifications. It's discussed in your chapter. You can map out which items address those specific objectives. You can also go even further to talk about, does this item address it at a higher order or a lower order thinking level? But one can see here that objective 1 appears to be fair if we only had 5 items, say 5 essay items, for example. Objective 1 is fairly well covered. 2 is okay, 4 is better, and 3 is totally missing. So these sorts of matrices can really help you identify whether or not you're covering the content and whether your test, therefore, will be a valid measure of what you instructed. Okay? Another method of determining content validity is to have the test and or items reviewed by a panel of experts. For the ETSs of the world and in Princeton, for example, they're going to use true experts. You're going to go next door to the teacher who teaches the same subject area that you do and ask him or her to help you look at your exam and see if it's covering those objectives that you wanted to have covered. You're going to also ask him or her to give you suggestions. Preferably pick out a teacher who's been doing this for a while. And there's just wonderful collaborative efforts that can be made, and I think your validity of your tests will go up. Okay? Let's talk a minute about construct validity. How accurately does this test measure construct, like knowledge, skills, or attitudes that I want to measure? It's usually determined for standardized instruments, not classroom-based tests. And the reason for that is because in order for me to determine whether there's a validity of an instrument measuring a construct like empathy or efficacy, you have to have a really extensive mapping of what are the elements and the sub-elements of what constitutes efficacy or self-esteem. So it really is left pretty much to the psychometricians at ETS to come up with those sorts of things, and the University of Michigan. Okay? Criterion-related, also known as predictive validity, is another method of determining whether or not an instrument has validity. Do the results of test A correlate to those of test B, which is a well-known and accepted measure of XYZ? For example, let's say you designed an inventory of personality test and you wanted to see if it had comparable validity, and you gave it to a group of at least 30 subjects, remember, and you wanted to see if it had comparable validity to the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, which is a very well-respected and acceptable measure of personality. One would do that by correlating the scores if you could get access to those scores. Do the results of test A predict XYZ? Most often, this type of validity is applied to standardized tests rather than classroom-based tests. For example, the GRE, Graduate Record Exam, is valid and reliable for predicting success in graduate school, as measured by ETS and as measured by correlating scores in graduate school to graduate GPA. The SAT, particularly the verbal section of the SAT, is a valid predictor of success in college as measured by correlating scores to GPA as well. So typically, this type of validity is used primarily for those high-stakes tests.